سبيل الدموع سبيل مريح، تنهدى يا صاحي كي تستريح، وبث الدعاء الخفي الصريح، يسعك الفضاء الرحيب الفسيح. سبيل الدموع سبيل.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome again to another episode of Muslims in non-Muslim lands, a legal study with applications. And if you recall from the last episode, we'd covered part 1 of the traditional Usul and the political legal jurisdictions, referring to Diyar, as in Darul Harb, Darul Islam, and things of that nature. We'd covered the theoretical part of that understanding of political legal jurisdictions, and we explained in what way the reason for this kind of identity, both of a religious identity and also initially of a tribal, and then of in latter centuries of a nationalistic identity. We then wanted to, or what we're going to turn our attention in particular for this part, is to explore how the three approaches that we've been discussing since the beginning of this series, which has been the literal approach, the liberal approach, which is the method of modernism at the moment, and the traditional approach. And we want to see is how do they understand the world? How do they split the world up from a Muslim perspective, from an Islamic perspective? Are they of the view of this concept of Darul Harb, Darul Islam? Is there something in between? What's the traditional view? Because the argument clearly given by many academics and Orientalists is that Muslims view the world as Darul Islam and Darul Harb, and that's it. There's not a nuanced approach. There's nothing in between. It seems to be a black and white, us and them type of attitude. So with that introduction, I'm going to now sort of go through those three approaches. So the first approach is the literal approach. And the literal approach, as you can understand, does literally go back to times gone by and sees the world splitting into two halves. A half referred to as Darul Harb, and a half referred to as Darul Islam. And therefore there are two states in the world that exist. Either a state is an enemy state towards Muslims, or the state is a Muslim state, and that's how it determines them. Now this is a very simplistic attitude, because what it doesn't take into consideration is what if there's two Muslim states, but one Muslim state is the enemy of the other, and the two Muslim states are actually at war. And to say that Muslims don't go to war is somewhat nonsensical, in that we can see throughout the history of Islam, in fact to the very early stages of Islam, that Muslims have had to fight one another for various reasons. So what is it that the literal approach applied themselves at? What is it that what are they using? And what they're using is the embryonic stage of Islam and the Muslim community in Medina. And as the Muslim community in Medina was growing, every group of people, because in those times there was no sort of borders drawn up, nationalistic borders, it was basically whatever level of authority that one person in charge could exercise his authority, geographically speaking, that was considered as his land. So this fledgling community living in Medina, they would consider those around them either as friend or as foe. And those who they would see as friend, obviously there'd be nothing to worry about, but those who they would see as foe would be clearly something to be concerned about. So what happened was this dichotomy of Darul Islam, which was in Medina, and Darul Harb, which was outside of Medina, particularly in Mecca, and yet lands which hadn't come into contact, or peoples who hadn't come into contact with the Muslims. And this was this Darul Islam and Darul Harb. And so it was an empire, and this was an era where it was the state of war was the sort of the status quo, you could argue. It was the standard protocol. It was the view that all people had, was that the empires were always, individuals were pushing for their empires to grow and grow, and they wanted to push their influence. And this is nothing new. We see that even now in the 21st century, that countries or particular ideologies, which are the basis of those countries, people want to exercise the influence of their ideologies beyond their borders. This is, this is a normal, natural way in order for that state, especially if it's a powerful one, to feel safe and protected. So it would exercise its influence and have allies so that it can remain in peace and its way of life can continue. And that was really what existed there. And it's the literal approach that take this view of a Darul Islam and Darul Harb. But what it does do is that it makes life difficult, if not near impossible, for anybody who chooses to live outside of what's been termed as Darul Islam. And what's been termed as Darul Islam has also somewhat requires further elaboration, because what is Darul Islam? Is Darul Islam a Muslim majority state? Well, what if that Muslim majority state don't apply Sharia? Is it still considered as Darul Islam? What if there was a non-Muslim majority in a country, but they were at peace with Muslim states around it? Would that be considered as Darul Islam? So this is not a detailed approach. It's a very simplistic approach. It would be very simplistic because it's using the concepts of the very early stages in Islam, where those sort of concepts existed, and it's not taking into consideration the 1400 or so years of history in which Muslims have had to engage with people both within their societies and outside of their societies. So from that introduction, or from that explanation, you can clearly see that those who adhere to this particular concept of these political legal jurisdictions are those who don't adopt a particular madhab. And they are those individuals who express the view that the political system should be exactly how the political system was in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, but not taking into context how much the world has changed. So in essence, what they argue is that anybody who lives outside of the Muslim majority state or Muslim countries are living in Darul Harb, and what they should be doing is migrating back to Muslim lands, and which they shouldn't have gone to the non-Muslim from non-Muslim lands, which they shouldn't have gone to in the first place. So that's the argument. So it's a very utopian model, a model which lacks pragmatism and realism. It doesn't take into consideration the real world scenario. According to that understanding, any non-Muslim country would be considered as Darul Harb, and that's an enemy state, and that's how their view would be. So that's the liberal approach. Next, we're going to look at the literal approach. It's so similar, so every now and then it's a change of a letter, T to a B, can happen. So now let's explore the liberal approach. Now the liberal approach, say that the dichotomous Darul Harb and Darul Islam no longer are relevant. They are outdated. So what they say is that, well, look, the liberals want to take a non-confrontational approach. And as a result, they remove the political aspects of Islam. And by removing the political aspects of Islam, what they say instead is that there should be the concept of Darul Ijaba, and there should be Darul Dawah. So lands should not be split according to their political position with respect to Islam. It should not be with respect to the legal position, but it should rather be based on a faith-based understanding. And that faith-based understanding is Darul Ijaba, which means they are those lands who are the abode of response, meaning they have accepted Islam. And they would be the states under Muslim rule. And then you have Darul Dawah, which is the abode of those being called Dawah, where they're being invited towards Islam. So you can see how these are split up very differently. And it says that these, instead of applying it to the lands, that these should be applied to the people rather than the lands themselves. So what it does do there as well is it removes the political clout that a Muslim group of Muslims could have if, like, for example, in the Mughal Empire, that even though numerically the Muslims were few, they had a political dominancy, and as a result established Islam within what was sort of historical India. So there's a big change away from there, and this is what the liberal approach tries to push in trying to understand that. And they give examples of what there's no need for migration, in challenging the position that the literalists took, to say, well, look, there is no need for migration. We shouldn't think of it as a Darul Harb, because we saw a situation in which the Prophet of Allah ﷺ sent his companions to Abyssinia, which is now the present-day Ethiopia, and they stayed there, and they were under the protection of a Christian king. And there was no, and even when the Prophet ﷺ had left for Medina, those Sahaba, those companions who were, or some of those companions in Abyssinia, did not all return to Medina. They stayed there. So that clearly shows that it was permissible for them to continue to reside in that particular land whilst their rights were being protected, whilst they were being able to practice their religion freely. And I have touched upon a number of the two key points that the liberal approach takes away from understanding lands based on religion. And what they do take away is the political and legal responsibilities. Because what we have to bear in mind, and as we progress through today's particular episode, what we will see is that Muslims, when they are in a political majority, whether numerically or otherwise, they have a legal and political responsibility to establish certain parts of the Sharia. For instance, the validation of public worship. These are certain responsibilities. Collecting and distribution of zakah. Tanfidul ahkam, executing the law. The hudud, jihad, commanding rights and forbidding evil. Hifzuddin, making sure the deen is protected and preserved. Collection and distribution of jizya, kharaj and ushur. And sadaqah, which is referred to the tithe. So you can see here that there's various hukuk Allah, there's various rights and responsibilities of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that are required when the state is established, and hukuk al-ibad, which is the rights of man. So what we're seeing here, and there's others, non-sharia responsibilities, for instance, like building of roads, building of bridges, maintaining masjids and things like that. Now that won't be possible if the sharia is not applied. So by the liberal approach taking the method and the argument it takes, what it does is strips away from Islam its political and legal structure, which it has to have in place when it is a political majority. And it just turns it into a matter of faith only, as in it's either people have accepted Islam or they're being called to Islam. Not that those who have accepted Islam, do they have now added responsibilities now that they are actually in charge of this piece of land, now that they are actually in charge of this group of people who have accepted Islam freely without any coercion or pressure. So how does the liberals look at Western countries? And when liberals look at Western countries, in some cases they would go as far as to describe them as Dar al-Islam, because they will say, well, look, we're protected here in these Western countries. We can practice our faith. We can carry out our acts of worship. We can build masjids, mosques. We can collect zakat. We can distribute zakat. We can learn about hadith. We can learn about fiqh. We can learn about tajweed. We can learn all the sciences, all the ulum of the Sharia and study it without any blocks or people refraining or stopping us from doing these sorts of things. So arguably, it's very much Dar al-Islam. So they're talking about Dar al-Islam in being able to practice religion, again, because they're removing the actual legal structure there. Then this is obviously becomes somewhat problematic. And at worst, it's Dar al-Dawah. Dar al-Dawah meaning that here we are calling people towards Islam. So so we had the literal view. And the literal view saw any lands in which it was a non-Muslim majority, politically speaking, then that was Dar al-Harb. And we had the liberal approach, which was even saying that Western countries could be as far described as Dar al-Islam, never mind Dar al-Harb. And if we had to sort of, meet on middle ground, then it would be Dar al-Dawah. So that's the two Diyar or Darain that I've mentioned so far, Daran. We're now going to look at the traditional approach. Now, who comes up with the liberal approach? Well, the liberal approach is those who are approaching the text, approaching the nusus with a liberalist sort of ideology, with a liberalist attitude. In what they're trying to do is apply present-day customs and present-day morals and present-day ethics and apply them to these source texts and refute and ignore those which don't sit well, or even go as far as diluting those which don't sit well with these liberal attitudes, and that's the liberal approach. The traditional approach, well, to date with this particular series, we've very much been focusing on the Hanafi madhab, the Hanafi school of law. So as in this case as well, we're also going to do very much the same, that we're going to focus on the Hanafi school. And when you look at a main text, or a key text rather, which is in Hanafi madhab on this type of science, on this type of ilm, is looking at Imam Shaybani's rahmatullah alayhi, his book called As-Siyar al-Kabir, which is quoted in Imam Sarakhsi's rahmatullah alayhi's book called Mabsut. And this is what we're going to look at. And I spent some time sort of going through, looking at the terms which existed within the book, and in terms of, is there just this dichotomy? Is there just Darul Islam and Darul Harb, and that's it? How do the traditional scholars view this? Those who had direct access to the nusus, those who were experts and who had actually practically applied this Sharia, practically applied this fiqh beyond the time of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the various peoples and geographical locations they found themselves in. So what we see is that this classification, this splitting the world into two, Darul Harb and Darul Islam, is an oversimplification. Or it's a too general inference. What we're looking at here is that this kind of view that this single huge landmass of people, this homogeneous area of Muslims was called Darul Islam, and it was just this one huge homogeneous area, and you had this other huge chunk of land which was called Darul Harb. It just didn't work like that. We see that it's not a single landmass. And I mentioned as well, when I introduced the liberal approach, and in the liberal approach I talked about the fact that lands were split between Muslims and non-Muslims. Well, what about those lands? And the ones which were Muslims were called Darul Islam, and the others were called Darul Harb, as in the land of the enemy. But hold on a second here. What about if you had a country neighbouring one Muslim country neighbouring another Muslim country in so-called Darul Islam, but they were actually enemies of one another, they were fighting one another? So would that make the other country Darul Islam? Would it not make it? Would it make it Darul Harb? So this kind of complication, this kind of nuance, this kind of practical understanding is missing, is lacking. So we see here in Imam Ibn Abidin mentioning, rahmatullah alayhi, in which he's talking about inheritance. And when and you might be thinking, what's that got to do with what we're talking about? But you'll be surprised. And when he's talking about inheritance, he says that it's suspended. Inheritance is suspended between two relatives in different territorial states. And I'll give you this sort of translation here that I put together. It says the fourth reason for suspension of the transfer of wealth after the death of one individual to his inheritor is due to, as he put it, ikhtilaf ad-darain, meaning the existence of two different dar. The difference is due to the different power. So that's how he's equating a dar, which is what I've said so far, is that a dar, a country, a piece of land, whatever, it's considered as belonging to an individual who can exercise authority over it. And where he can't exercise authority over it, then we will say that's not his land. But if he can exercise authority upon this land, if he has absolute power, if he has an army to defend it up to that point, then that will be considered as his land, and anything beyond that will be considered somebody else's. So the difference is due to the different power, army, or because of different kings. For instance, one of the two kings is in India, and he has a state and an army, and another king is in Turkey, and he has another state and an army. So here you've got a king in India and a king in Turkey. Now, India and Turkey are not a million miles away from each other, and they're both within what was termed as Muslim lands, Darul Islam. But the difference is not that the religion is different, the difference is the political structure is different. So it doesn't suggest religion is playing a part here, it's suggesting the political situation is determining when a dar starts or when a dar finishes. And it mentions here that he has a state and an army, and another king is into and his state and army, and the treaty of protection is terminated between them. Meaning, so that it's no longer illegal for one member of the state to kill the other. Meaning they have no peace treaty between the two of them now. So when they had the peace treaty, it was as though they are being considered as one dar. Once the peace treaty was removed or terminated or whatever reason, or it fulfilled its time, its duration, then they are now become daran, two separate dars, two separate states. Hence, between the two states, the transfer of inheritance ceases. Why? Because the transfer of wealth from one state to another state is based on protection and friendship. Because if money moves from state A to state B, and state A and state B are enemies now, then state A becomes weaker when that money comes out from this state, and strengthens state B when it gets transferred to there, making that country obviously much stronger. And also, it's how do you get that money across, especially when you're at war, and war will obviously normally be at the border, because that's where the two armies can meet. So this is how you're going to get that, how you're going to get that cash or whatever it is across there, or property or whatever it is. He does say, ending the paragraph, however, if there is assistance and cooperation between the two against mutual enemies, then this is regarded as one dar, and the transfer of inheritance will subsist. So, key point there. So you can see here that Imam Ibn Abidin, rahmatullah alayhi, one of the last great scholars of the Hanafi fiqh, Hanafi madhab, is clearly defining the dar in very much modern terminology. The difference being is now we use nationalism and we use some arbitrary borders, or in some cases arbitrary borders, in other cases natural borders where there's rivers or maybe mountains or something which could naturally suggest that that's where the lands should separate. But he's talking particularly about quite an interesting and developed understanding of dar. Very much more moved on from the very simple world that the Sahaba, particularly just after the Prophet ﷺ and at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, was very much more simplistic. You're seeing now a much more complicated world taking place, where Muslims can be enemies of their own, and quite clearly. And we can see here that India and Turkey were Muslim states at that time. But the potential, however remote or hypothetical, of them becoming enemies of one another still existed in that time. So that's an interesting point as a separate issue altogether. When I went through the text of As-Siyar al-Kabir, I found that there was no less than 6 different political definitions of a territory. We had Darul Islam, we had Darul Harb, but then we had Darul Shirk. So the question arises, what's the difference between Darul Shirk and Darul Harb? We had also Darul Kufr, we had Darul Sulh and Darul Muada. So these are Darul Harb, which I'm going to translate here as enemy state, Darul Shirk, which is a non-monotheistic state, so religion is deciding matters in that country, and the religion which is a polytheistic faith. We then have Darul Kufr, which is a non-Muslim state. We have Darul Sulh, which is a peace treaty state, or a state which one has a peace treaty with. Darul Muada, which is again very similar. And you have other variants of very much these terms. We have Darul Aman, and we have Darul Hudna. So whether that's a peaceful state or a state which one has a truce with. So you can see that there's a number of different varieties that exist. Now it could be, or one argument could be made, these are just synonyms of one another. And the fuqaha just decided to use Darul Shirk sometimes, Darul Kufr sometimes, Darul Sulh sometimes, Darul Muada sometimes, Darul Hudna sometimes, Darul Aman sometimes, Darul Sulh other times, and Darul Harb other times. That's one argument. I don't accept that argument. I think clearly here the fuqaha are mentioning, and what they are mentioning is different states, depending on the relationship with that one particular Muslim state. That's what it's referring to here. We also see, for example, that when Islam spread, and particularly when it spread and reached to the Sham and Philistine and towards the Mediterranean, what we saw is that it came into, literally, clashed with Christendom. And you see that the ulama, the fuqaha, spend a lot of their time deliberating and discussing the relationships between Muslims on the border of Europe and the European Christians, or those Christians who had made their way into Syria or Greater Syria, and those who had made their way into the Holy Land, Palestine, and lands around that area. It was mainly talking about those relationships because they were a greater body. Christendom was huge. Whereas there are other relationships which Muslims had, smaller colonies in India, in Africa, in China, and you do not find much discussion within the text about those particular colonies. So the key point became this relationship between Islam in the East and Christianity in the West. It was mainly based upon that. Why? Because there was transfer of goods, transfer of people, transfer of knowledge. They were always battling one another on the boundaries over the Holy Land. In some cases even going beyond into Europe. In some cases the Christians coming across into the Middle East. And it was because there was a large interaction there, there was a large number of issues coming from there. So political discussions had to be made. In fact, we have that very discussion about when Imam Muhammad put together a Siyar al-Saghir, and he was belittled for doing it. And then in retaliation, he put a Siyar al-Kabir together. Why was he being belittled? Because he was in Iraq, which was in the central part of the Muslim empire, Muslim world. And when his books had reached Syria, they ridiculed him because they said, how can this man living all the way in Iraq know how to deal with people politically like Christians? Who was he referring to? So he must have been referring to Christians, because that's where the border was, with Christendom. So we see that this is very, very interesting. And but again, what we find is that the books are full of rulings with respect to traders traveling to non-Muslim lands. What they can and can't do, how long can they stay for, etc., etc. Can they do business with these individuals? What can they do? Loads, you see. Because obviously, why? Because that was the bigger need for the time. That was the biggest situation at that time, and they needed to provide that information. But you don't see any rulings, hardly any rulings at all, which are referring to Muslims taking up permanent residency in non-Muslim society. And the reason for that is quite simple, because that was alien to early Islam. That was unknown. Why? Because the Muslim world was an advanced world in both hygiene, town planning, research, whether it was research within the Islamic sciences, whether it was research within literature and poetry, whether it was research in science, in medicine, astronomy, translating the Greek works, adding to the Greek works, having them translated then into Latin. That was all happening within the Islamic world. So why would anybody in their right mind leave a world that was a global leader, leave a part of the world that was leading the rest of the world into enlightenment, into light, and head and take up permanent residency in areas where there was no support for the weak, there was no hospitals, there was no provisions for anything at all. It just didn't happen. That only happened in great numbers, as we've seen in the 20th century. Why? Because the world has kind of changed now. Now the West is a global leader. The West is providing, particularly if we look at Britain, the West is providing free medical care for its citizens. And now you find so many sad stories within the Muslim world where individuals are paying extortionate prices in order to carry out most of the most basic medical treatment, which is available free within Britain. So you see, the world has changed, and that's why you see there is there's one exception which is worthy of mention, and that's the Muslims who were living in Spain, or who were referred to as the Mudijars. And this was after the reconquest had taken place by the Christians. We saw, for example, the Maliki jurists, because Maliki school was a predominant school within Andalus, talking about this now becoming Darul Harb. So what I have done then is trying to bring all this together. You'll find obviously in my book on page 142, I've then split, in my understanding is, we have then Darul Islam at the top. So we've got two areas, Darul Islam and Darul Kufr. So let's concentrate on Darul Islam. So Darul Islam, we have then breaking off into Sharia applied and Sharia not applied. So that's Darul Islam. On the other side then we have Darul Kufr, or you can call it Darul Shirk, synonymous. From that we have two forking out from there. One is Darul Harb and one is Darul Sulh. So the state is Darul Kufr. Yeah, it's using non-Islamic principles because it's a non-Muslim political majority. And it's not using the Sharia to determine its law. So that's why it's called Darul Kufr. It's not tainted in any political position it's adopting yet. Is it friendly? Is it for? That happens in the branch down. When it branched down, then either it can be a for, Darul Harb, or it can be friendly, Darul Sulh. But also bear in mind as well, these are fairly generic titles. Now we have many, many Muslim countries. So it could be that one non-Muslim country is Darul Harb to one Muslim country, but it's Darul Sulh to another Muslim country. So we saw, for example, Saudi Arabia joining up with Britain in order to wage war against Iraq. So Iraq is a Muslim country, Saudi Arabia was a Muslim country, but Saudi Arabia actually went to war against Iraq by joining with a non-Muslim country. So you see the sulh took place between those two, and the Muslim country was attacked. Now we can agree or disagree, and we can argue all day long, but the point is we don't have, or individuals like listening to this, don't have the legal authority to decide what the individuals in charge of Saudi Arabia choose to do. They have their own political domain. Those individuals who are in charge of it have every right, because they can exercise the authority. They're the Sultan, they will exercise the authority as they see fit, whether we disagree or agree. That's an academic point. The point is that who has the legal, or who is in position of power, position of authority to be able to make those decisions. And that's what we're talking about. So it's a very grey, it's a very nuanced, it's a very particular world. And this is what we'd expect, because we do live in a sort of grey world. We do live in a world which is not so black and white as we are led to believe, or we would like to believe ourselves. We are now very much all sharing and living in all sorts of lands, and that needs to be understood. So Dar al-Islam is a Muslim majority country, so a Muslim politically speaking. Now a Muslim politically speaking, or a Muslim majority country, then the individuals should be making all efforts to apply the Sharia, because as Muslims having authority, it is binding upon them to be applying the Sharia. However, that does take time. So we can look at countries like Pakistan, we can look at other countries who are actually referred to as Islamic Republic of Pakistan, which is clearly detailing within its country name that it's Islamic. But there'll be certain practices within in Pakistan which may not meet up to that standard, but there are people and individuals working towards that, because again it's a complicated process. It takes time, and we can have similar discussions regarding other countries in the Middle East, Egypt and other countries. And obviously we see a lot of Western involvement in the Middle East, which obviously doesn't help things, makes things even more so complicated. So it is the responsibility of the government to provide aman, to provide state security, civil order. That's its responsibility to all its citizens, Muslims or non-Muslims. That's what it's doing. That's its duty, to be concerned as a government. So even though in Darul Kufr aman may exist, safety may exist, whatever, but that's not sufficient for it to become Dar Islam, as I sort of posed the question. Why? Because it's not mukallaf. What does it mean by mukallaf? It's not required by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not responsible legally to apply Islamic law, because the first thing they have to do is accept Islam. If they haven't accepted Islam yet, then how can they be mukallaf for applying the Islamic law that's required with that? That would come subsequently once they had accepted Islam. So that clearly shows that that's not the deciding factor. So the deciding factor obviously is that those individuals who have that authority, those Muslims who have that authority, it is their responsibility when they're in that position of power to slowly to bring that in. So we can see this term from the six that I mentioned, Darul Islam, Darul Harb, Darul Sulh, and the Diyars that I've mentioned. And there's plenty along those sorts of discussions that I mentioned within the text. And there's one or two other points that I mentioned in my research, but I'm not going to bring them to detail now because I'm weary of the length of each one of these episodes, and I'm trying my best to keep them at a sort of reasonable size. And so as a result, please, I reference you my text to go there and read it in your own time. Now, what legal application is there within these various lands? Well, let's look at Dar al-Islam. Well, Dar al-Islam is pretty straightforward. If you were living in a state which was described as Dar al-Islam, and remind you again, it's a state in which the Muslims have political clout, political majority. In those cases, there would have to be the application of and obedience to all individual and community Islamic laws. The ability to accept immigrants from Darul Harb, because obviously in Darul Harb the Muslims are being persecuted, they're being targeted, they're being killed, and as a result they need some safe passage and they would need to go there. The financial assistance and support of poor and helpless Muslims in Darul Harb as well. Those who can't make, they should be able to financially assist them. And also a furthering of the influence of Islam beyond the borders of the state. Like I mentioned to you already, any state, any state which wants to become powerful, it needs to become at least a regional player, if not a global player, in trying to influence those around them initially, and then to even further afield, in order to be able to keep practicing and living the way they choose to live their life. Now, if we look at that, we can categorically, clearly say that no Western country can be described as Dar al-Islam. Why? We can't. The first one is the first one. We can't apply and be obedient to all individual and community Islamic laws. It's impossible, because the government and the laws which come from the House of Lords and how they come about, they are not based on Islam. They are not based on the Nusus. They may have some link to the Christian faith going back centuries, but in reality, it's just basically down to how the laws are being developed, very much so in a secular framework. So they can't be Dar al-Islam. Well, let's go to the opposite extreme then. Is it Dar al-Harb, as would the literalists believe it is? A Dar al-Harb state is outside the borders of a Dar al-Islam state, which seems to be fine. As it is not possible to practice Islamic law in Dar al-Harb, its applications are suspended, meaning there is no Islamic law. And Muslims living in Dar al-Harb state are considered not culpable for not applying the law. So that would mean in any shape or form, in all ways, whether of mu'amalat or whether of ibadat. So when Muslims are not permitted to openly study and practice their faith in Dar al-Harb, then any shortcomings in their knowledge of Islam is excused. When the citizens of Dar al-Harb are in a state of war against a Muslim country, then in principle their lives and property are open to attack by Muslims of the state they are at war with. So you can clearly see it is not, that this is pretty sure that, Dar al-Harb is a hostile enemy state, and not just a normal non-Islamic state. It is aggressive towards its own citizens, Muslims. It targets them, it oppresses them, it takes their rights away from them, it forcibly tries to convert them, it holds them in suspicion. Now, whilst I'm saying this, some of you might be saying, well, hold on a second here. That tide does seem to be changing in Europe. That tide does seem to be changing in America. And it is a valid point to make. And this is why, powers that be in both sides of the argument need to really take a step back and say, well, where are we taking this? This attitude and this rhetoric is not necessarily sort of helping anybody's problem. All it's doing is pitching people against one another. And whenever we pitch people against one another, it just leads to conflict and then eventually to destruction. So we all need to kind of take a step back a little bit and see where we want to go, because folk can live happily together. It's how we arrange that, and at the same time not have to give up key beliefs and key practices, or rather not give up beliefs and key practices. That's the key point here. So what you're seeing here is that Dar al-Harb is a pretty hostile, very Muslim non-friendly place, and it makes life exceptionally difficult to be able to live in that surrounding. So what do we say about the countries in the West? Are they at this point? No, they're not. Because if they were at this point, then a person would not be able to build a masjid. If they were at this point, a man would not be able to keep a beard. If they were at this point, a woman would not be able to practice hijab. If they were at this point, there would be no such thing as halal meat. Now, all of those points suggest, and these things wouldn't be practiced in Dar al-Harb. Like I told you, Dar al-Harb is a state which is at open war against Muslims, both its own citizens and those residing outside of its influence. And we can see, as much as times are difficult for Muslims at the moment, we are not at that point. We are not at a point. So therefore, Muslims must continue to practice their religion. But hold on, that's not what he said for Dar al-Harb. That's what he said for Dar al-Islam. And we also said it's not Dar al-Islam. So we don't seem to be fitting into Dar al-Harb, clearly, and we don't seem to be fitting in Dar al-Islam. We're hoping that there's something which is going to meet us in the middle. Now, if we took the literalist view, there wouldn't be. If we took the liberalist view, we were wasting our time. We shouldn't even be having this discussion, because they say it's got nothing to do with the legal side. It's got nothing to do with the political side. It's just to do with the belief or otherwise. Well, we did have Dar al-Sulh, as we said. And we had all its synonyms, which we've just sort of grouped together under Dar al-Sulh. And Dar al-Sulh is still a state outside of the borders of Dar al-Islam. But unlike Muslims living in Dar al-Harb, Muslims living in Dar al-Sulh will not be excused of being ignorant of the Sharia ruling and its applications. the dealings between Muslims in Dar al-Sulh and between Muslims and other Muslims must be settled in that country itself. It is not necessary for Muslims to migrate, or emigrate rather, from Dar al-Sulh. They can live there happily, reside there permanently. It is permissible to defend Dar al-Sulh and to assist the majority population there. For example, we see the companions, radiallahu anhum ajma'in, assisting Negus in Abyssinia against his enemies. In the case of an offensive as opposed to defensive war, Muslims should choose or should avoid being involved if it's an unjust war, especially when the war is against a Muslim. So if it's a defensive war, if the country that they're living in, let's take Britain for example, is being attacked by, I don't know, China say. So if China decides to wage war against Britain, then Muslims are required to stand shoulder to shoulder with its fellow citizens in defending their country. Because this is a heinous act, this is an aggressive act, this is an act of aggression, and attacking a land, and we as Muslims are responsible to stand with our co-citizens and defend the land that's being attacked. However, if it's an aggressive war, if say Britain decides to go to war somewhere else, and the war is considered as unjust, then Muslims need to refrain from those sorts of wars. Because Muslims are not supposed to be unjust. They're not supposed to kill for no reason. They're supposed to kill only in extreme situations. Absolutely extreme situations. And this does not warrant it. The earlier example I gave you, which was to defending land, that is an extreme situation because they're defending against an aggressor who for no reason has decided to attack the country. But in this case it's not. And especially if that war is against fellow Muslims. Because here now, if it's an unjust war and it's a war against fellow Muslims, this person is going to have to pull a trigger and kill another Muslim. And he has to really think deeply about what it is he's doing here and the repercussions of that. So as Muslims in Dar al-Sulh live in peace and security, then the lives and the property of non-Muslims are also inviolable. Un-Islamic practices like usury, riba, and trading in alcohol or whatever are impermissible. Whereas in Dar al-Harb, well, there is no Islamic law. There is no Islamic law, so there's nothing preventing a person doing anything. So you can see here, now hold on a second, we have found middle ground, which is what our argument has been throughout this series, is this middle ground. And this middle ground is not just something which has been made up, but this middle ground is actually based upon the fiqh understanding of our pious predecessors. Those who have actually taken the theoretical law and applied it, not in a vacuum, but applied it in real life, and realizing that the countries and powers that be and people are changing. And it's making sure that this, but it's not just something like, say, the liberalists, who have completely removed any form of identification of Islam altogether. It's removed the legal part of Islam, it's removed the political part of Islam, and it's just said it's a mere calling people towards Islam or those who've already accepted the call to Islam. So it's again avoiding the two extremes and being in the center. So, but one key point that I do want to mention, and as I'm sort of drawing to a close, is that this is a reactionary ruling, in that it's the reaction to the way the host state is dealing with the Muslims. So when the host state is good to the Muslims, then the Muslims are legally bound to return that, to reciprocate that. But if the host state decides to take its citizens, Muslims, as an enemy, then we can clearly see the repercussions of that. And this is what we need to do, is, all of us need to come around a table and settle these in a mature way, in order not to cause any harm on either side. And this is the traditional school which gives this understanding than any other school does, or rather any other interpretation. The two in particular that we've looked at is the liberal and the literal interpretation. So again, we've hopefully proved to you in the two parts of this section that traditional understanding, traditional school clearly has a way of continuing to interpret its surroundings and be able to give an answer to people living as Muslims in a different world compared to the world that Allama ibn Abidin lived in. A world now which is a very different world, yet those principles can still apply. What we will turn to next is we now have the theory, we now have the practice, we now have the land or the ruling of the land, and that's the ruling that we say, that Britain is Dar al-Sulh, most of the Western countries are Dar al-Sulh. We now have the ruling in the land, so everything is in place now. Now what we're going to do for the next couple of episodes is apply traditional Islamic law, particularly the Hanafi law, Hanafi fiqh in the West, and see, do we find it wanting? Can it still apply itself within this scenario? And if so, how it does so. So I hope you can join me for those 2 episodes, inshallah ta'ala, as we progress through, and then eventually we will reach the conclusion. So we're nearing the end. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
فسيح سبيل الدموع سبيل مريح تنهدى يا صاحي كي تستريح وبث الدعاء الخفي الصريح يسعك الفضاء